Delegates and friends and colleagues, I'm terribly sorry I can't be with you. It's one of those circumstances over which I did not have control. I wanted so much to be at the conference. I actually had an ulterior conspiratorial motive. Vilnius is located just a 3 or 4 hour car drive from where my father was born. I have never been to his village. I thought that after the conference closed, I could pick up and visit the village and try to see whether there were any historical remnants of what was once a thriving Jewish community. But alas, because I cannot be with you, I cannot do that. So my conspiratorial motives are overcome. And I am left with the need to address you in this fashion. That obviously requires me to begin with 2 disclaimers. First, I don't know really what has gone on at the conference. I have a sense from the agenda of some of the subjects which have been reconnoitered, but obviously I don't have a feel for the speeches that have been made and the positions that have been taken, and I therefore am somewhat self-conscious about making these remarks, presumably at the end of the conference, at a conference where I have not been in attendance. I may therefore be both repetitive and irrelevant, and I beg your indulgence. The second thing is that I've never made a speech to an inanimate object before. I've always made speeches where I can assess the response of the audience. I can't imagine a speech into a camera, which is what I'm doing, for use on a screen where you are. You must forgive me for that as well. I offer apologies if from time to time I seem rather wooden or odd. This is a new experience for me. It's excruciating. I can't tell you how difficult it is, but I'm certainly going to try. I have no doubt that the conference has heard a number of heartrending stories and analyses which reflect the brutal and offensive behavior of governments towards injecting drug use. I can recall when I was in Moscow in October of 2011 at a conference dealing with the Millennium Development Goal on HIV and AIDS, a conference that was supported and sponsored by UNDP. I remember hearing at the time with fellow panelists some stories which weren't just heartbreaking, they were so deeply offensive and repugnant in the way in which governments were treating their citizens who used drugs. And I was appalled at that moment, and I have no doubt that the conference thus far has generated some of those stories. But against that backdrop of inhumanity and not wanting to repeat what is obvious, I have 3 points I'd like to make. One of them, I must admit, will be fairly obvious. The other 2, at least in the articulation of them, may be somewhat unexpected. So the first obvious point. Both of the reports that have so far been published by the International Commission on Drug Policy and the report of the Commission on HIV and the Law, on which commission I was fortunate enough to participate, have made the point, unanswerable, irrefutable, that the war on drugs has been a lamentable and total failure. In fact, of course, it's been a war on drug users, not on drugs. And it has sustained tremendous human damage and suffering across the world. And the war on drugs has, of course, been obsessed with the criminalization of drug use and with punitive responses. And it has, of necessity, accelerated the pandemic of HIV and AIDS. Indeed, the particular document by the Commission on Drug Policy indicates that the war on drugs has effectively, criminalization has effectively been the primary producer of HIV. It has fueled the global pandemic. And there's nothing amorphous or contentious or controversial or speculative about that. The war on drugs has been a lamentable failure. Everyone at this conference knows that. It's just the obtuse rigidity and stupidity and malice of governments which have refused to accept that truth. And that leads me to the second point I wanted to make. The last major recommendation of the Commission on HIV and the Law indicated that the three international drug conventions, which are ostensibly in place to govern drugs generally, the three international conventions need complete review, complete redrafting, top to bottom. They're simply not functioning. And although they pretend to have moments where public health is at the center, they pay virtually no attention to public health at all. Their focus tends to be on abuse of drug use, and they have very little feeling, compassion, concern about the health consequences. Now, overseeing the tripartite conventions on drug use is the International Narcotics Control Board, the INCB. And as far as I'm concerned, let me just say it without any equivocation whatsoever, it is a hopelessly revolting outfit without much sense and without much credibility. It works behind closed doors. It doesn't give any transparency. And I've done something in preparation for these very few remarks, which I don't always do. I read every single page of the 131-page document of the INCB 2012 report. It was like self-immolation. It absolutely clobbered me to read the nonsense in that report. The president of their board of 13, one of whom has recently died, so there are now 12. The president of the board, in his introductory statement, was again completely obsessed with criminalization. As a matter of fact, what really worried him was the legalization of cannabis for non-medical purposes, which certain countries like states in the United States are now embracing, and he wanted to make sure that we all understood that this was a violation of the international conventions. HIV/AIDS was mentioned 3 times in the 131-page document. It was mentioned once in passing in respect to Portugal. It was mentioned once in passing in respect of the Caribbean. And it was mentioned once in passing with the use of the words, I'll read them exactly, abuse of prescription drugs by injection increases the risk of HIV. And that was the total regard for HIV and AIDS in the entire International Narcotics Control Board report, which is supposed to be seized of the issues which flow from the use of drugs. The words harm reduction appeared not once in the 131 pages. Not once. And it tells you something about the behavior and the delinquency and the irresponsibility of the people who run the International Narcotics Control Board. As a matter of fact, in a fairly elaborate recitation of what was happening in Africa as a result of the use of drugs, a quite lengthy section of the report, pointing out that injecting drug use and drug use generally in Africa was causing increasing problems. It names a number of countries, almost all of which have very high prevalence rates of HIV and AIDS, but not once did the report say anything about HIV and AIDS themselves. And that tells you what the report is designed to do and what the report is designed to avoid. Of course, the report had time to criticize the Government of Canada and the Supreme Court of Canada for the finding that the INCITE injecting drug use site, the site which provides for clean syringes and needle exchange in downtown Vancouver in Canada, that the report finds time to point out that INCITE is a violation of the international conventions. I remember back in 2006 when I was still envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa, I commended INCITE in the downtown east side of Vancouver as being a very important response to the transmission of HIV through injecting drug use. And I received a letter the next day, more accurately, the Secretary General of the United Nations received a letter the next day from a very high official in the International Narcotics Control Board who said that I should be removed from my job for my public support for, quote, opium dens, close quote. You see, these people are fundamentally nuts. They say things and they believe things which are so punitive and so objectionable in the responsible conduct of public business that it's really unsettling. They're so damnably arrogant and contemptuous of what is important in life. And so not only is there no reference to harm reduction, but of course there is no reference to clean needle and syringe programs. There's no reference to opioid substitution programs, and certainly not to therapy and other evidence-based dependence treatment, drug dependence treatment. It never enters their minds that they're doing so much damage in the conduct of their review and oversight of the 3 international conventions. You know what I'd like to do? This will seem to you faintly mischievous, but believe me, it beats deeply in my heart. What I'd like to do is to criminalize the International Narcotics Control Board. Not to criminalize the use of drugs, but to criminalize the International Narcotics Control Board, and to put all of them, I'd like to put all of them in drug detention centers for a year and let them understand what they're doing to so many perfectly innocent people who have a health problem in other parts of the world. And then it strikes me that we should go after members of the board individually. There are only a dozen of them. They come from various countries. They have a high list of credentials which are supposed to give them authority and knowledge. I have a bunch of credentials too, but it sure as the devil doesn't give me credentials and knowledge in a whole variety of areas. I think we should go after them by way of op-eds and by way of letters to the editor and by way of press conferences, and just nail these hypocrites to the mast. And that brings me to the third and final point I want to make. Just as we should name people on the INCB who have failed to do the job for which they are mandated, or more accurately, embrace the punitive side of the job rather than the public health side of the job, because the conventions are supposed to provide both, I think it's time to name and shame the countries whose policies are so delinquent. And frankly, the United Nations system is failing us in that respect. The United Nations system, wittingly or unwittingly, is supporting the criminalization of drug use in a way which is fundamentally destructive and leads to fueling the global AIDS pandemic, as the Commission on Drug Policy has indicated. Now, the United Nations system has a lot of different parts, and the United Nations Development Program, in supporting, with the help of UNAIDS, the Commission on HIV and the Law, has obviously taken quite a principled stand. But the organization that is at the center of what we're dealing with, the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, notice the word crime, the UNODC, which is a cooperating partner of UNAIDS, plus WHO, they have to be much more vigorous, much more determined, much more aggressive, much more principled in their pursuit of decent policies. I was in Pretoria not long ago, and I had a so-called debate with the regional head for Africa of UNODC, a very lovely fellow. He was a lawyer from Senegal, and he'd been involved in the International Criminal Court activity around Rwanda. I mean, a very knowledgeable guy. But what unsettled me was that he emerged as a kind of apologist for the views of the International Narcotics Control Board. He gave an impression of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is seized with HIV and AIDS. I mean, if you look at their website carefully, they're supposed to be doing significant things on the pandemic in order to contain the virus. But it's such an addendum. It's such a minor part of their inherent punitive view that these international conventions are designed to criminalize and to be punitive. And of course, they don't go after the people they should go after. Have you ever heard of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime attacking, excoriating, going after Vladimir Putin as president of the Russian Federation for his refusal to acknowledge the damage that is being done in the Russian Federation towards injecting drug users? I mean, here is a country whose policies are so unbelievably destructive. And of course, nothing is ever said about him publicly. Of course, you won't get it from the executive director of UNODC, will you? Russia virtually bought the executive directorship of UNODC, so Fedotov is not likely to accuse Putin of anything. But in truth, Vladimir Putin is committing crimes against humanity. Tens of thousands of people are suffering, some of them dying, on his watch, and he knows it. Crimes against humanity don't always have to relate to conflict. They can relate to broader social truths. Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, should be hauled up before the International Criminal Court for refusing to roll out treatment for HIV and AIDS when tens of thousands of people were dying in his presence, and he knew it and did nothing about it. So what separates that conduct from the conduct of the president of Russia? UNAIDS, the Secretary General, WHO, and certainly UNODC should hold a major press conference and identify the Russian Federation and many other countries in the region where this conference is located as being in violation of basic human rights. And don't pull your punches. Sure, it won't change overnight, it never does. But it may shame countries gradually into shifting their policies. And that's what this is all about. This whole conference has been engaged in one of the most monumental struggles for human rights we have. And you're taking a strong stand, and you're collectively showing tremendous tenacity. And I salute you for your courage. And I tell you to grit your teeth and hold on, because one day the pendulum swings. And when it swings, human rights and justice emerge. I wish you well. Thank you for having me.